He asked only for a meal, but his question would leave the city's elite in stunned silence. The Grand Legacy ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and laughter from the wealthy elite. Then silence fell. At the archway stood a man in a worn army jacket, his boots leaving dusty prints on polished marble. He wasn't supposed to be there. His voice, raspy but steady, cut through the chatter. "Can I play it for food?" At first they laughed. A beggar asking to touch a piano worth more than his life? Impossible. But what none of them knew, what none of them could imagine, was that his next move would turn their cruelty into silence, their certainty into shame, and reveal a truth so powerful it would leave the entire room changed forever. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. He had survived bombs and bullets. But this gilded ballroom? This was a new kind of war zone. An old man, lost in a coat that had seen better decades, stood at the edge of a sea of tuxedos and gowns. He asked for a meal in a voice raspy with disuse, not knowing his simple request was about to shatter the foundation of their carefully constructed world. The air in the Grand Legacy ballroom was thick with expensive perfume and roasted duck. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto the 200 men and women below. They were the city's elite. CEOs, surgeons, heirs who moved with the easy confidence of people who had never been told no. Laughter, light and brittle, echoed off the marble floors. A symphony of self-satisfaction. Into this perfect, polished world stepped a ghost. "Excuse me," a voice said, a low rumble immediately out of place. It was weathered by wind and time, cutting through the light chatter like a shard of glass. He stood just inside the grand archway, a man who seemed to have wandered in from another century. His army green field jacket was frayed at the cuffs, worn thin at the elbows. Gray hair unkempt. A beard of the same grizzled color covered a face etched with lines that told stories of hardship, not success. His shoes were scuffed work boots, leaving faint, dusty footprints on the gleaming floor, each one an act of defiance against the room's pristine elegance. He wasn't just out of place. He was an affront to the very idea of the evening. A ripple of silence spread from the entrance. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. Eyes accustomed to assessing net worth in a single glance narrowed with disdain and confusion. "How in the world did he get in here?" a woman whispered, clutching her pearl necklace as if the man's poverty might be contagious. "Security," someone barked from a table near the front. The voice belonged to Richard Thompson, a man whose tailored Italian suit cost more than the old man had likely seen in a year. Richard was 45, with a face that was handsome in a cruel, sharp way. An air of entitlement clung to him, more closely than his cologne. He was a real estate developer who had inherited his father's firm and doubled its profits by bulldozing low-income neighborhoods, making way for luxury condos. To him, compassion was a liability, a weakness he despised in others and had long since stamped out in himself. The old man seemed not to hear the rising tide of hostility. His eyes, pale, faded blue, scanned the room, not with the desperation of a beggar, but with the calm, assessing gaze of a soldier surveying new terrain. He saw the shimmering gowns, the glint of gold on wrists, the dismissive sneers. He saw everything. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, his movement stiff but determined. "Please," he repeated, his voice a little stronger now. "I don't want a handout. I saw the piano. Can I play it for a plate of food?" His request hung in the air. So absurd, so utterly out of place that for a moment there was only stunned silence. Then a single harsh laugh broke the tension. It was Richard. He threw his head back and roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated mockery. Others, taking their cue from him, joined in. Soon the ballroom was filled with a chorus of cruel laughter, washing over the old man in waves. He stood his ground, his expression unreadable. His gaze had settled on the magnificent grand piano sitting on a low stage in the center of the room. It was a Fazioli, a concert grand with an ebony finish so deep it seemed to swallow the light. Its perfection was a stark contrast to the man's own worn existence. Near the kitchen doors, a young waitress named Emily Carter watched, her heart clenching in her chest. She was a college student working 2 jobs to pay her tuition. She recognized the quiet dignity in the old man's posture. She had seen that look before in her grandfather's eyes after he came back from his tour, the look of a man who had given everything and was now being asked to beg. She started to move toward him, a glass of water in her hand. But the hotel manager, a nervous man named Peterson, grabbed her arm. "Don't you dare, Emily," he hissed, his eyes darting toward the wealthiest tables. "He's not our problem. Getting involved will be the last thing you do at this hotel." Emily froze, torn between her job and her conscience. Her eyes met the old man's for a fleeting second. She tried to convey an apology, a flicker of solidarity. But he was already turning his attention back to the crowd. "Security!" Richard Thompson shouted again, his face red with indignation. He was on his feet now, gesturing angrily. "Get this bum out of here. This is a private event. We paid for exclusivity, not to be accosted by street trash, who think they can just wander in and ask for handouts." Two large men in black suits began to move from the sides of the room. They advanced on the old man with the lumbering, unavoidable purpose of freight trains. The crowd quieted again, anticipating the sad, inevitable spectacle of his removal. But the old man simply raised a hand, a gesture that was not defensive but commanding. The security guards paused, momentarily confused by his unexpected authority. "Please," he said, his voice calm and steady, directed at Richard. "Just one song. That's all I ask. For a hot meal. I haven't eaten properly in 2 days." It was a lie, of course. A carefully constructed one. He had eaten a perfectly adequate meal at a small diner just a few hours earlier. But he needed to see them for who they were. He needed to know what lay beneath the polished surfaces when they thought no one of consequence was watching. This whole evening was a test, and the subjects had no idea they were being graded. Richard laughed again, a short, sharp bark of disbelief. 2 days, and you think that's our concern? The world is full of lazy men like you who refuse to work. You make bad choices, you end up on the street. It's called personal responsibility. Maybe you should try it sometime. "He's right," chimed in another man at Richard's table, adjusting his silk tie. "We all worked hard to be in this room. We earned our success. Nobody handed us anything." The old veteran almost smiled. He knew for a fact that the man speaking had inherited a software company and nearly driven it into the ground before being bailed out by his family. And Richard? Richard hadn't worked a truly hard day in his entire pampered life. The old man knew Richard's story better than Richard knew it himself. He played his part, letting his shoulders slump. "I've tried, sir," he murmured, his voice thick with feigned despair. "But nobody wants to hire an old man. They say I'm not good for anything." "And they're right," Richard snapped, stepping closer now. The smell of expensive whiskey wafted from him. "Look at you. Filthy old. What value could you possibly bring to anyone? Your place is on a street corner with a cardboard sign. Not in here among people who actually contribute to society. People who matter." "People who matter," the old man echoed, his voice suddenly losing its tremor. It was a subtle shift, but a few people noticed. "And what is it that makes a person matter, sir? The suit? The bank account?" "Exactly," Richard said, jabbing a finger in the air. "Merit. Success. We deserve to be here because we've proven our worth. You are nothing but a drain. A ghost haunting the edges of a world you failed to conquer." The old man's eyes drifted back to the gleaming Fazioli piano. It sat there like a silent judge, its polished surface reflecting the ugly scene. "One song," he said, his voice a quiet plea again. "That's all the proof I have." "You probably don't even know which end of the piano to sit at," someone jeered from the crowd. "He'll ruin the ivory with those grimy hands," another added, followed by a ripple of disgusted agreement. Richard's eyes lit up with a sudden malicious idea. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He held up his hands for silence. "You know what?" he announced, his voice booming with false magnanimity. "Let's let him play." A confused murmur went through the room. "That's right," Richard continued, climbing onto his chair to address the entire ballroom. "Let's give our guest a chance. An opportunity to entertain us." He savored the moment, the absolute power he felt as 200 pairs of eyes focused on him. "Here's the deal." He pointed a manicured finger at the old veteran. "You play us one song. If you can get through it without sounding like a dying cat, I will personally buy you the most expensive meal on the menu." The crowd buzzed, sensing the theatrical cruelty of the game. "But," Richard added, his voice dropping dramatically, "when you fail, and we all know you will fail, you will be escorted out by security, and you will crawl back to whatever gutter you came from, and we will all get to witness what happens when you give false hope to those who have earned their misery." The old man, Walter Hayes, felt his pulse quicken, not with fear, but with a cold, thrilling sense of anticipation. The trap was set. The first part of his lesson was about to begin. The circle of expectant faces around him felt like a Roman arena, and he was the gladiator they had all come to see devoured. He could almost taste their hunger for his humiliation. It was a hunger to confirm their own superiority, to justify their indifference. "Place your bets, ladies and gentlemen," Richard shouted, turning the humiliation into a grotesque spectator sport. "How many notes do you think he can play before he gives up?" "I'll give him 5 seconds," yelled a man in the back. "I'll bet $100 he can't even play a proper scale," laughed a woman dripping with diamonds. Her laughter was like the tinkling of ice in a glass, cold and empty. Walter moved toward the piano, adopting a slow, pained shuffle. Every step was calculated. Every flicker of his eyes was part of the performance. He made his hands tremble as he reached for the polished lid of the piano, his rough, calloused fingers looking shockingly out of place against the flawless black lacquer. "Be careful with that," Manager Peterson squeaked from the sidelines, wringing his hands. "That instrument is worth more than your entire life, old man." Another wave of laughter rolled through the room. But this time, Walter noticed it was not universal. He saw Emily, the young waitress, watching from the kitchen entrance, her face a mask of shame and pity for the crowd. One of the security guards shifted his weight, his expression uncomfortable. Even a few of the older guests looked away, a faint blush of embarrassment on their faces. But Richard was basking in it. He had pulled up a velvet chair to the edge of the stage, settling in to enjoy the show like a king at a public execution. "Before you begin," Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension, "let me make the terms even more interesting." He paused for effect. "If by some miracle you actually manage to impress us, let's say you play well enough to make someone in this room shed a single tear of emotion, I'll double the offer. Not just a meal. I'll give you $1,000. Cash." The ballroom erupted. It was the perfect insult. $1,000 was nothing to these people. It was a bar tab, a tip, the cost of a new pair of shoes. Offering it as a grand prize was a way of saying that the man's ultimate, impossible achievement was worth less than their pocket change. $1,000, someone bellowed. "He'll probably faint just thinking about it." Walter sat on the plush leather bench, feigning awkwardness. In reality, he knew this Fazioli model intimately. He had one just like it in the music room of his secluded estate, a place no one in this room knew existed. But tonight, he was not the man who owned that estate. He was a ghost, a reflection of their own forgotten humanity. "What will you be gracing us with?" Richard sneered. "Twinkle, twinkle, little star? It's probably the only tune you know." More laughter. Walter remained silent, looking down at the 88 keys as if they were an ancient, cryptic text he couldn't decipher. He needed them to underestimate him completely. He needed their arrogance at its absolute peak before he began to tear it down, note by painful note. "Cat got your tongue," a woman taunted. "Probably has no formal education," Richard declared loudly, playing to his audience. "No musical training. But we must be patient. We can't expect too much from a man who has clearly wasted every opportunity life ever gave him." Walter slowly lifted his head, his pale blue eyes finding Richard's. "Opportunities," he murmured, his voice just loud enough to be heard in the sudden quiet. "Oh, he speaks." Richard clapped his hands in sarcastic delight. "Yes, opportunities. The chances were all given to make something of ourselves. Everyone in this room took theirs. That's why we're here and you're there." "And where were you born?" Walter asked, his voice soft but clear. The question caught Richard off guard. "What does that matter?" "Just curious," Walter said, his eyes scanning the faces of the other guests. "Where did all of you grow up? What schools did you go to?" A palpable discomfort began to spread through the ballroom. While some here were self-made, many, like Richard, were the products of immense privilege, born into a world of private schools, family connections, and inherited wealth. "That's irrelevant," Richard snapped, his composure starting to fray. "What matters is what we did with what we were given." "And what did I do with what I was given?" Walter asked, his voice still gentle. "Clearly nothing," Richard exploded, his voice raw with contempt. "Look at yourself. You are a complete and utter failure. A nobody." The words hung in the air, their venom shocking even some of the more callous guests. Richard had crossed a line, moving from casual cruelty to something deeply personal and vicious. Walter looked down at his hands, then placed them over the keys. A hush fell over the room. This was it. 200 people waited for his failure, for the final confirmation of their own superiority. They waited for the dissonant, clumsy notes that would prove that some people were simply worth less than others. He closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them, something had changed. The vacant, weary look was gone. In its place was a focus so intense, so profound that a few people in the front row shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "What song is it?" Richard demanded again. But his voice lacked its earlier confidence. It was now tinged with inexplicable nervousness. Walter took a slow, deep breath. "A song about a promise," he said. "One I learned a long, long time ago. A friend taught it to me. In a place very far from here." "How touching," Richard sneered, trying to regain control. "A little sob story to win our sympathy." "Well, it won't work. Now play." Walter pressed his right finger down on a single key. Middle C. The note that emerged from the Fazioli was not the clumsy, uncertain sound they all expected. It was perfect, pure, resonant, and impossibly clear, hanging in the silent air like a drop of liquid silver. It was a note played by a hand that knew the soul of a piano, a note filled with quiet, sorrowful beauty that cut through the room's cynical atmosphere like a hot knife through butter. He held the note for 5 full seconds, letting its power and mystery sink into every person in the room. When he finally lifted his finger, the silence that followed was different. It was no longer the silence of cruel anticipation. It was the silence of stunned, genuine surprise. "Beginner's luck," Richard muttered, but a frown creased his forehead. His voice was a low whisper, as if he were trying to convince himself more than anyone else. That single perfect note had been played with the kind of control that took years, not luck, to master. Walter's hands moved again, his fingers gliding over the keys with unnatural grace. He played another note, then a third, weaving them together into a simple, haunting melody. It wasn't Beethoven or Chopin. It was something they didn't recognize. It sounded like an old folk song, something born in the mountains or on a lonely prairie. Simple yet infused with a profound sense of loss and longing. "What is that?" someone whispered. "I've never heard that before." Richard leaned forward in his chair, his eyes narrowed in concentration. This wasn't going according to plan. A homeless man wasn't supposed to know how to play with such feeling, such control. He was supposed to bang on the keys, create a cringeworthy spectacle. He was supposed to fail. The simple melody began to build. Walter's left hand joined in, adding deep, resonant chords that gave the music a foundation of sorrow. The music spoke of rain-soaked fields and long marches, of letters never sent home, of the faces of friends lost too soon. It was a soldier's lament played with the heartbreaking authenticity of a man who had lived it. His fingers, which had looked so rough and clumsy just moments before, now seemed to be extensions of the music itself, dancing over the ivory and ebony with a familiarity that could only come from a lifetime of practice. He was holding back, reining in the full force of his talent, giving them just enough to shatter their expectations, but not enough to reveal his true identity. It was a masterful game of suspense, and the entire room was his unwilling audience. "He must have heard it on the radio somewhere," Richard said, his voice tight. He was trying to provide a logical explanation, to shrink the old man and his talent back down to a manageable size. Anyone can memorize a simple tune. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. He could see the subtle shifts in tempo, the delicate control of the pedals, the way Walter leaned into a chord to give it more weight. This wasn't mimicry. This was artistry. Walter could feel Richard's unease. He could see him shifting in his velvet chair, the music acting not as entertainment, but as an interrogation of his own shallow soul. The haunting melody filled every corner of the ballroom. A strange magic began to work on the crowd. The whispers stopped. The waiters froze in place, trays of champagne forgotten in their hands. The security guards at the door had turned, their faces slack with wonder. The music was a magnet, pulling every bit of attention in the room toward the shabby old man at the piano. "He's actually very good," a woman admitted, her voice filled with reluctant awe. "Good," Richard hissed, though he kept his voice low. "It's a cheap trick to get our sympathy." But the lie was wearing thin. The music was becoming more complex. Walter began to weave a second melody into the first, a counterpoint that was faster, more intricate. It was a passage that required a dexterity no amateur could ever possess. For a brief moment, he allowed a flicker of his true virtuosity to show. His fingers became a blur, flying across the keys in a cascade of brilliant, perfect notes that made several people in the audience gasp. For 10 seconds, he played like a world-class concert pianist. The sound was breathtaking, a torrent of musical genius that was as shocking as it was beautiful. "My God," a man in the front row breathed, his voice trembling slightly. Richard shot up from his chair, his face a mask of disbelief. "Impossible," he choked out. He can't do that." And just as quickly as it had appeared, the brilliant flash of mastery was gone. Walter returned to the simpler, sadder melody, as if that incredible burst of skill had been a mere fluke, a happy accident. He finished the piece with a few soft, final chords that faded into a profound, ringing silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire room seemed to be holding its collective breath. They had come expecting a farce, and had instead witnessed something deeply, inexplicably beautiful. Emily was openly weeping now, tears streaming down her face. The music had touched a place of grief in her she thought she had buried long ago. Her grief for her grandfather, who had come home from the war a different, sadder man. A very old gentleman with kind eyes and a face that showed a life of both struggle and success slowly rose from his table and approached the stage. His name was Abraham Stevens, a man who had built his manufacturing empire from nothing but grit and intelligence. He had been a patron of the arts for 50 years and knew a master's touch when he heard it. He stopped a few feet from the piano, his eyes filled not with pity, but with deep, sincere respect. There were tears glistening in his own eyes. "Young man," he said, his voice gentle and raspy with age, "where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Walter looked up at him. For the first time that evening, he dropped the submissive act and truly met someone's gaze. "Here and there, sir," he replied, his voice even. "My mother taught me the basics. The army taught me the rest." The answer was ambiguous, yet entirely true. His mother had indeed shown him his first chords on an old upright piano, but it was in the long, terrifying nights in field hospitals and makeshift bunkers, playing on whatever battered instrument he could find. That music had become his anchor, his language for the unspeakable things he had seen. The army hadn't taught him technique, but it had taught him what music was for. It had taught him about soul. Mr. Stevens nodded slowly. "Your mother was a fine teacher. And the army, it seems it was too." Richard Thompson could not stand it any longer. His carefully ordered world was being turned upside down. "Stevens, don't be a fool," he snapped, marching toward the stage. "You can't seriously be falling for this. He's a homeless nobody. People like him don't play the piano." "And why not, Richard?" Mr. Stevens turned to face him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Richard's sputtering rage. "What law of nature says that a man who has fallen on hard times cannot also possess a great gift?" "Education," Richard spat. "Opportunity. Money. He has none of those things. You need those things to learn an instrument like this." "Access to what exactly?" Walter asked softly, his hands still resting on the keys. His voice cut through Richard's tirade, silencing him. Richard sputtered, caught off guard. To proper training. To the best teachers. To conservatories." Walter allowed a small, sad smile to touch his lips. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his eyes sweeping across the silent, watching crowd, "you don't just learn music in expensive schools. You learn it by living. You learn it by hurting. You learn it when the melody in your head is the only thing keeping you from going insane. You learn it when you have nothing else left." His words resonated through the ballroom. Several guests, even the most cynical among them, found themselves nodding in agreement. They were simple, powerful words of truth, and they exposed the poverty of Richard's own worldview. "Play again," Mr. Stevens requested, his voice soft. "Please." Walter turned back to the piano. But as he began to play again, there was a definite shift. The mask of the humble beggar was beginning to slip, and the passion he had been holding back started to bleed through into the music. He chose a piece by Chopin this time, the Revolutionary Etude. It was a piece born of anger, defiance, and desperate love for a lost homeland. It was a declaration of war. The first thunderous chord crashed through the ballroom, making people jump in their seats. The music was a tempest, a furious, swirling storm of notes that spoke of struggle and rebellion. It was impossibly fast, impossibly complex, and he played it with a fire that was terrifying and beautiful to behold. Richard Thompson watched, his face draining of color. He felt a knot of pure panic tightening in his stomach. This was no longer a game. This was an unraveling. The old man at the piano was not just playing music. He was dismantling Richard's entire belief system, the one that said wealth equaled worth and poverty equaled failure. That old, worthless man was demonstrating a power, a genius that Richard knew he could never possess. "Stop it!" Richard yelled, taking a step toward the stage. "I said stop." But his voice was swallowed by the magnificent fury of the music. No one was listening to him anymore. They were all prisoners of the man at the piano. The performance had ceased to be a plea for food. It had become a judgment, and everyone in that room, especially Richard, was being weighed and measured. The story was not over. The true revelation was yet to come, waiting in the wings like the final devastating movement of a symphony. What had started as a spectacle of cruelty was transforming, note by powerful note, into a moment of truth that no one in that gilded room would ever forget. The final thunderous chords of Chopin's Etude crashed down upon the grand legacy ballroom, each note a hammer blow against the walls of arrogance and privilege. The music was a living thing, a storm of sound that had ripped through the complacent atmosphere, leaving in its wake a stunned and shattered silence. For a full minute after Walter's hands lifted from the keys, no one dared to breathe. The fury of the music still echoed in their ears, a phantom of the raw, untamed power they had just witnessed. Richard Thompson was pale, his skin the color of old parchment. He stared at Walter, his mouth slightly agape. The old man, the bum, the failure, had just channeled the soul of a revolution through his fingertips. Richard felt a cold dread seeping into his bones. It was the primal fear of the powerful when confronted with a force they cannot control, cannot buy, and cannot understand. He saw the looks on the faces around him, awe, shame, confusion, and realized with a sickening lurch that he had lost the room. He was no longer the ringmaster. He was just a clown in an expensive suit. Mr. Stevens stood near the stage, his old eyes fixed on Walter. He was a man who appreciated precision in his factories, in his business dealings, in his art. What he had just heard was more than precision. It was a perfect marriage of technical flawlessness and profound, world-weary soul. It was the kind of performance one might hear once in a lifetime in the grand concert halls of Vienna or Moscow, not from a man in a tattered army jacket playing for his supper. A memory flickered in the back of his mind. A story he'd heard decades ago about a young prodigy. A soldier who played the piano on the front lines, his music a beacon of hope in the darkest of places. But the story had ended in tragedy, the soldier lost to the fog of war. It couldn't be. Emily, the waitress, leaned against the wall by the kitchen, her hand pressed against her heart as if to keep it from beating out of her chest. The music had shaken her to her core. It wasn't just beautiful. It was true. It spoke of a pain so deep and a defiance so fierce that it made all the petty concerns of her own life, and the ostentatious wealth of the people in this room, seem utterly insignificant. She looked at Walter not with pity, but with a reverence usually reserved for heroes. Walter sat on the piano bench, his back straight, his breathing even. He let the silence stretch, allowing the full weight of what he had done to settle upon them. He could feel their judgment shifting, their certainty cracking. He had their complete, undivided attention. Now it was time for the second part of the lesson. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his hands back to the keyboard. A low murmur rippled through the crowd. They thought the performance was over. What more could he possibly do? His fingers touched the keys again, but this time there was no thunder, no fury. The notes that emerged were as soft and gentle as falling snow. He began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune. If the Chopin had been a storm, this was the quiet silver light that followed. The melody was exquisitely simple, achingly beautiful. It was a song of memory, of moonlight on still water, of a peace that could only be found after a long and brutal war. Each note was a teardrop, a prayer, a whisper of hope in the darkness. The emotional whiplash was staggering. He had shown them his fire. Now he was showing them his heart. He played with a tenderness that was almost unbearable to witness. He closed his eyes, his head slightly bowed, lost in a world that only he and the music inhabited. The audience could feel him communing with ghosts, with memories of people and places long gone. The music was no longer a performance. It was a confession. This was the piece that broke them. The woman who had laughed about his grimy hands found herself covering her mouth, a sob caught in her throat. The man who had bet he couldn't play a proper scale was staring at his own manicured hands, as if seeing them for the first time, wondering what they had ever created that was half as beautiful. All across the room, the hard, cynical facades began to crumble. Tears welled in eyes that hadn't cried in years. The music bypassed their intellect, their status, their wealth, and spoke directly to the small, hidden part of them that still remembered how to feel. Mr. Stevens felt a single warm tear trace a path down his wrinkled cheek. The old story, the legend of the battlefield pianist, came rushing back to him with undeniable force. They called him the Phantom of the Piano, a young corporal whose music could make hardened soldiers weep. But he was supposed to have vanished, presumed dead after a heroic act of sacrifice. Could this old, weathered man truly be him? Richard Thompson watched the scene unfold with growing horror. He saw Mr. Stevens wipe a tear from his eye. He saw others in the crowd openly weeping. The bet, the impossible, humiliating condition he had set, play well enough to make someone in this room shed a single tear, had been met. And not just by one person, but by dozens. He had been so certain of the man's failure, so confident in his own superiority, that the certainty now lay in ruins around him. The $1,000 felt like a pittance, an insult to the majestic talent on display. But it was more than the money. He had been publicly, spectacularly wrong. He, Richard Thompson, had been made a fool of by a homeless man. The humiliation burned hotter than any anger. Walter brought the piece to a close, the final notes hanging in the air like dust motes in a moonbeam before fading into absolute silence. This silence was different from the last. It was deeper, more profound. It was a silence filled with respect, with awe, and with a heavy dose of collective shame. For a long moment, Walter simply sat, his hands in his lap. Then he slowly pushed the bench back and stood up. As he rose, his posture changed. The weary slump was gone. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his spine straight. The transformation was astonishing. He was no longer a hunched-over vagrant. He looked like a soldier standing at attention. He turned to face the room, and his eyes, clear and sharp, locked onto Richard Thompson. "You owe me $1,000, he said. His voice was no longer the raspy, pleading murmur from before. It was a clear, steady baritone filled with an authority that commanded attention. Richard, flustered and enraged, fumbled for his wallet. He pulled out a thick wad of $100 bills and strode to the stage. He didn't want to hand it over. He wanted to throw it. He wanted to re-establish his dominance, to reduce this moment back into a simple transaction. A rich man paying a beggar for a service rendered. "Here," he spat, thrusting the money toward Walter. "Take your charity and get out. You got your meal. The show is over." Walter didn't move to take the money. He simply looked at Richard's outstretched hand, then back up at his face. "I don't believe I mentioned anything about charity," he said, his voice cold as steel. "This was a wager. One that you proposed and one that you lost." He let the words hang in the air, a public rebuke. Richard's face turned a blotchy red. Humiliated, he dropped the money onto the piano's gleaming surface. The bills scattered across the black lacquer, a vulgar stain on a sacred object. Walter ignored the cash. He took a step forward, his gaze sweeping across the room, holding the eyes of every person he looked at. "For a few moments tonight," he began, his voice ringing with newfound power, "you all listened. You listened to the music, but I wonder if you heard what it was saying." He paused, letting the question sink in. "That first song, the simple one. A friend wrote it for his daughter, a girl he would never get to see grow up. He hummed it to me the night before he died in a frozen trench halfway around the world. He made me promise I would play it for his family if I ever made it back. I never found them, so I play it for him." A wave of sober realization passed through the crowd. This wasn't just music. This was testimony. "And the Chopin," Walter continued, his eyes finding Richard again. "The revolutionary etude. It is a piece about fighting back against tyranny. It is about refusing to be crushed by those who believe their power gives them the right to erase you. It is the sound of a man who has lost everything but his honor and who will not surrender." His gaze was so intense that Richard took an involuntary step back. "And Claire de Lune," Walter's voice softened slightly. "That is for the quiet moments in between. The moments when you remember what you were fighting for. It is for the peace that so many of us earned, but so few of us ever truly found." He walked slowly from the stage onto the ballroom floor, moving with a grace and confidence that belied his ragged clothes. The crowd parted for him as if he were royalty. He stopped directly in front of Richard. "You spoke of opportunity," Walter said, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the silent room. "You said I had wasted mine. Let me tell you about the opportunities one was given. At 19, I was given the opportunity to carry a dying friend 2 miles through enemy territory. At 20, I had the opportunity to hold a radio and call in an air strike on my own position because we were being overrun. It was the only way to save the rest of my company." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. The man who had mocked him for not taking his opportunities had done so from a position of inherited wealth. This man had been given opportunities to sacrifice, to suffer, to die for people like Richard. "I had the opportunity," Walter continued, his voice hardening, "to spend 3 years in a prisoner of war camp, where the only thing that kept me and the other men sane was humming the melodies of Beethoven and Mozart in the dark. Because music was the one thing they couldn't take from us." Mr. Stevens, who had been listening with rapt attention, finally stepped forward. His face was ashen. The pieces had clicked into place. The legend was real. "My God," Mr. Stevens whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. He looked at Walter, but he was speaking to the entire room. "Don't you know who this is?" All eyes turned to the old industrialist. "During the war," Mr. Stevens said, his voice growing stronger, "there were stories that came back from the front. Stories of a young corporal, a musical prodigy from a small town in Ohio, who became a legend. They said his music was a weapon against despair. They said he would find ruined pianos in bombed-out churches and play for the troops, reminding them of the home they were fighting for." He turned back to Walter, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and profound reverence. "They called him the pianist of the Ridge. After the battle at Hill 749, where he saved his entire platoon by volunteering for a suicide mission to draw enemy fire, he was reported missing, presumed killed in action. He was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously." Mr. Stevens took a shaky breath, his eyes never leaving Walter's face. His name was Corporal Walter Hayes. A collective, audible gasp swept through the Grand Legacy ballroom. The name echoed in the silence, a name from the history books, a name synonymous with heroism and sacrifice. They were not looking at a homeless man. They were standing in the presence of a legend they all thought was dead. Walter Hayes offered a small, sad smile. "Reports of my death," he said, his voice laced with weary irony, "were greatly exaggerated." Richard Thompson stood frozen, his world utterly shattered. He was staring at a ghost, a national hero, a man whose portrait hung in museums, a man he had called a failure, a bum, a nobody. The sheer catastrophic scale of his misjudgment was so immense, so complete, that he felt as if the floor was about to open up and swallow him whole. But the final, most devastating revelation was still to come. For Walter Hayes had not wandered into this ballroom by accident. He had a very specific reason for being here tonight, and his purpose had everything to do with the very event they were all celebrating. The name Corporal Walter Hayes fell into the stunned silence of the ballroom like a stone dropped into a deep well. The ripples spread instantly. An older woman at a table near the back gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Walter Hayes, it can't be. My father served with him. He spoke of him until the day he died." Another man, a retired judge known for his stoicism, pulled out his phone. His fingers, usually so steady, trembled as he typed the name into a search engine. The screen lit up with grainy black and white photos of a handsome young soldier, a brief biography, and the official citation for his Medal of Honor. He looked from the young face on the screen to the old, weathered face of the man standing before them. The eyes were the same, pale, clear, and filled with an ancient, knowing light. "It's him," the judge whispered to his table, his voice thick with disbelief. "It's really him." The whispers became a roar of hushed, frantic conversation. The story of Walter Hayes was not just a piece of military history. It was a part of the nation's mythology. He was a symbol of a bygone era of courage and sacrifice. And he was standing in their midst, wearing the clothes of a man they had just dismissed as human refuse. The shame in the room was a palpable, physical thing. It was thick and suffocating, clinging to the expensive suits and silk dresses like a shroud. Richard Thompson's mind simply refused to process the information. His brain was a frantic mess of denial and panic. "No," he stammered, shaking his head. "No, this is a trick. A lie. He's a con artist who read a history book. Walter Hayes is dead." Walter turned his calm, unwavering gaze back to Richard. "I assure you I am very much alive," he said, his voice quiet but carrying immense weight. "But for a long time, I preferred to be a ghost. It's simpler. Ghosts don't have to watch the world they fought for forget its promises. They don't have to see the honor they bled for get traded away for selfishness and greed." His eyes swept the room, and every single person felt the sting of his words. They had come here tonight for a charity gala, an evening to feel good about themselves, to write a check and pat themselves on the back for their generosity. They had seen it as an obligation, a social function. Not one of them had truly considered the people they were supposedly there to help. To them, the veterans were an abstract concept, a faceless, needy group to be pitied from a safe distance. But now that concept had a face, a name, and a voice that was holding them all to account. "You're all here tonight for a noble cause," Walter said, his voice taking on a new, sharper edge. "You are here to raise funds for the new downtown Veterans Support Center, a place meant to help men and women who have returned from service and found themselves lost. A place to offer them counseling, job training, and a hot meal. A place to show them that the country they served has not forgotten them." He let the irony of his statement hang in the air. "A worthy cause," he continued. So worthy, in fact, that an anonymous donor gave $5 million to get this project off the ground. That donation is the reason you are all here tonight. It paid for this ballroom, for your exquisite food, for the very champagne you were drinking when you laughed at a hungry old soldier. A new wave of shock rippled through the guests. They all knew about the mysterious benefactor. His generosity had been the talk of the city's philanthropic circles for months. Richard Thompson stared at Walter, a horrifying suspicion dawning in his eyes. It was a thought so preposterous, so utterly world-shattering, that he couldn't even form the words. Walter gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if reading Richard's mind. "I've been fortunate in my life since the war," he said simply. "I started a small business. It did well. Very well. I've always believed that the best way to honor the men who didn't come back is to take care of the ones who did. So when I heard this city was trying to build a new center, I wanted to help. I made the donation." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The room fell into a silence so complete that the clinking of a fork being dropped in the distant kitchen sounded like a gunshot. The homeless man they had mocked, the veteran they had scorned, was the very reason they were all here. He was their host, their benefactor, their judge. "But I don't just give my money away," Walter continued, his voice turning hard as granite. "I need to know it will be put to good use. I need to know that the people in charge of helping my fellow veterans actually care about them as human beings, not just as a cause to put on a letterhead." His eyes bored into Richard. "That is why I came here tonight like this. I wanted to meet the chairman of the fundraising committee. I wanted to look him in the eye. I wanted to see his character for myself." Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. His legs trembled, and he thought he might collapse. This wasn't just a social blunder. This was the complete and total annihilation of his reputation, his career, his very identity. He had been weighed and measured by the one man whose opinion mattered most, and he had been found grotesquely wanting. "You, Mr. Thompson," Walter said, and his voice was now devoid of all emotion. It was the flat, final voice of a man passing sentence. "You stood here tonight and declared that a man in my position was a drain, a failure, a nobody. You looked at a veteran who you believed had nothing, and you showed him nothing but contempt. You turned his plea for help into a cruel game for your own amusement." He took a step closer. Richard flinched as if he'd been struck. How can a man with so much poison in his heart be trusted to care for those who are suffering? Walter asked the room. How can he run a center that requires empathy when he has none? How can he honor sacrifice when he has never sacrificed anything in his entire pampered life? He didn't need to wait for an answer. The verdict was written on the faces of everyone in the room. Richard Thompson was finished. "Effective immediately," Walter announced, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "You are removed from your position as chairman of the committee. You will have no further involvement with the Veterans Support Center. I believe your presence is no longer required here this evening." He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The quiet finality of his words was more devastating than any tirade. Richard stood for a moment, his face a horrifying mask of rage, shame, and disbelief. He opened his mouth to say something, to protest, but only a strangled croak came out. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, for a single friendly face, but found only condemnation and disgust. Defeated, he turned and stumbled toward the exit, a broken man disappearing into the darkness he had so richly earned. A quiet applause started at the back of the room and slowly grew. Not for Richard's departure, but as an affirmation of Walter's judgment. Walter held up a hand, and the room fell silent once more. He wasn't finished. His eyes scanned the crowd until he found Emily, the young waitress, still standing by the kitchen entrance, her face streaked with tears. He beckoned to her with a gentle motion of his hand. Hesitantly, she walked toward him, her simple black and white uniform a stark contrast to the glittering gowns of the other women in the room. She stopped before him, looking nervous and overwhelmed. "What is your name, young lady?" Walter asked, his voice now warm and kind. "Emily, sir. Emily Carter." "Emily," Walter said, a genuine smile lighting up his face for the first time that night. "Tonight, I saw a great deal of ugliness. But I also saw you. I saw the kindness in your eyes. I saw you start to come to my aid when everyone else was laughing. You were willing to risk your job for a stranger you thought was in need. You, Emily, have the character that money can't buy and that hardship can't erase." He turned to the rest of the room. "This is the kind of person who should be working with our veterans. Someone with a compassionate heart." He looked back at Emily. "I understand you're a student. What are you studying?" "Social work, sir," she whispered, her voice trembling. I want to work with homeless outreach programs. Walter's smile widened. Of course you do, he said. Well, consider your tuition and all your student loans paid in full, starting tomorrow. Emily gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Sir, I can't. You can and you will, Walter said gently. And when you graduate, I would be honored if you would accept a position as the Director of Community Outreach for the new center. That is, if you're interested. Tears of gratitude and shock streamed down Emily's face. She could only nod, unable to speak. She had come to work tonight, expecting to serve drinks and clear plates. She was leaving with her entire future rewritten, a reward for a simple act of decency. Walter then turned his attention to Abraham Stevens. Mr. Stevens, he said, his voice filled with respect, you are a man who has built things that last, a man who values integrity. And you were the first person tonight to look at me and see a human being instead of a problem. The committee for the Veteran Support Center is in need of a new chairman. I can think of no one better suited for the task. Mr. Stevens, visibly moved, walked forward and clasped Walter's hand. It would be the greatest honor of my life, Corporal Hayes, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Finally, Walter walked back to the piano. He gathered the scattered $100 bills that Richard had thrown there. He walked back to the stunned, weeping Emily and pressed the wad of cash into her hand. I believe this is yours, he said softly. The prize for winning a bet you didn't even know you were part of. Mr. Thompson wagered that no one in this room could be moved to tears by my music. You and Mr. Stevens proved him wrong. You proved that humanity could still be found here. He gave her hand a final, paternal squeeze, and then turned to address the entire ballroom one last time. Look around you, he commanded. Tonight you saw a man in rags, and you judged him. You saw a man in a fine suit, and you followed him. You were wrong on both counts. Remember this night. Remember it every time you are tempted to measure a person's worth by the clothes they wear or the money they have. True worth is measured by the contents of a person's character, and it is often found in the most unexpected places. With that, he turned and began to walk toward the grand archway. The hotel manager, Peterson, who had been hiding in terror, rushed forward, his face slick with sweat. Mr. Hayes, sir. I am so terribly sorry. Please forgive me. I had no idea. Walter stopped and looked at the man. He didn't say a word. He simply held the manager's gaze for a long, silent moment. In that look, Peterson saw his own cowardice, his own pathetic deference to wealth and power, and he wilted, all his stammered apologies dying on his lips. Walter Hayes walked out of the Grand Legacy Ballroom, leaving behind a sea of 200 changed souls. He had entered as a ghost, an invisible man they had tried to erase. He left as a legend, a living monument to a truth they could now never forget. The story of that night would be told and retold for years. It became a local legend, a cautionary tale for the arrogant, and an inspiration for the kind. The Veteran Support Center opened 6 months later with Mr. Stevens at the helm and a passionate Emily Carter changing lives on the ground. It became a beacon of hope in the city, a testament to what could be accomplished when true character, not just wealth, was allowed to lead. And in that gilded ballroom, the beautiful Fazioli piano stood as a silent witness. It had been the instrument of a test, the vessel of a lesson. Its keys had channeled the sorrow of a soldier's lament, the fire of a revolution, and the gentle light of hope. The music, in the end, had done more than fill a room with sound. It had filled it with truth. Thank you for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. Stay tuned for more immersive stories.